So thank you for joining us today. For those who don't know me, my name is Darlene McLennan and I'm the manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, ADCET for short. To let you know that this webinar is being live captioned, you can activate the captions by clicking on the CC button in the toolbar that is located either on the top or bottom of your screen. We also have the captions available in the browser, in a browser, and we'll put the link into the chat now if you would like to access it there. Okay, I'm on Lutruwita, Tasmanian Aboriginal land, and in the spirit of reconciliation, ADCET respectfully acknowledges the Lutruwita nations and also recognise the Aboriginal history and culture of the land. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status. I also would like to acknowledge all the countries participating in this meeting and also acknowledge their elders and ancestors and their legacy to us and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait people participating in the webinar today. Today's webinar, Access for All, Championing Accessibility in the University Context, is presented by Dr. Agata Marva Monch. I forgot to practice the name, so I do apologise, and Julie Gardner. Agata is a lecturer and a degree director of Masters of Publishing at the University of Sydney, and Julie is an accredited editor and coordinator of the Institute of Professional Editors Accessibility Initiative. I'm very fortunate that I got to see this presentation or a similar presentation at the Print Disabilities Conference in Sydney this year, which was a very powerful event. If you get a chance to attend that conference in years coming, please do. It's some great sessions were held. Agata and Julie will be offering practical suggestions on how to write and publish with accessibility in mind in both research and educational context. Topics include planning and writing for accessibility, communication with publishers, and the importance of accessibility considerations when choosing publishing formats and designing educational matters. Before we begin, a few more housekeeping details. This webinar, as we said at the beginning, is being captioned by Helen from Bradley Reporting, and the recording will be made available on ADCET in the coming days. If you do have any technology difficulties, you can email us at admin@adcet.edu.au. Our presenters will talk for around 45 to 50 minutes. And at the end, we'll have 10 minutes or so for questions. For those who have been here before, you know, we use the chat box to chat with each other, and it's great because I forgot to mention that if you'd like to put the country you're into the chat box, please do. And people are doing that already, so we've got you so well trained, thank you. But if you want to ask a question of our panellists, if you could add that to the Q&A box, as that's where I'll be getting the questions for our presenters from. Also just a reminder that if you want to have the conversation with everybody, that you choose all panellists and attendees so that we can all have that conversation. All right, that's all for the housekeeping and the acknowledgements. Really excited to have you both of our presenters here today. So thank you so much for joining us and giving your time so freely to this really important topic. Really looking forward to hearing the presentation again. Okay, over to you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen, and thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation to talk about inclusive publishing practices and how they can be used in the university context. And I have to tell you that the presentation is completely different to what we talked about at the roundtable, because this was a launch of our guidelines. And today we'll go into far more practical details about how you can use them in the university context. And I'll also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, waters and sky in which we have been privileged to live and work. And on our behalf, I would like to pay respect to the Darawal, Gadigal and Gadigal people and their elders, community leaders and knowledge holders, past and present. So what we are going to talk about today. But first, we want to talk briefly about the accessibility trend in the publishing industry and provide a bit of context to our guidelines, the Books Without Barriers, a practical guide to inclusive publishing that we co-authors with a couple of colleagues. And then I'll talk briefly about how academic, library and disability staff can contribute to implementing accessibility in the university context. But we'll spend most of the hour today on practical suggestions of how to write and publish with accessibility in mind in both research and educational contexts. And Julie will talk about planning and writing, and then I'll take over and talk about inclusive design, formats and platforms. So that's the plan. And as Darlene said, it should take us about 45 minutes and we'll have plenty of time for questions. So accessibility 10 in publishing. In the context of book publishing, as you well know, the needs of people with print disability have been traditionally relegated to alternative format providers or disability organizations. And the access to content is usually provided by specialist libraries of organizations such as Vision Australia, and people require medical diagnosis to access those resources. Now, the growing interest in accessibility implementation in the publishing industry is the result of the confluence of three trends. The first one is the increasing recognition of the rights of people with print disability. The second one is the opportunities created by digital technologies that transform the capacity to produce, but also to read content in accessible formats. And the final one is the changing legal framework. The Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled, which came into force in 2016, was a pivotal point in improving access to books. And even though the Marrakesh Treaty didn't directly affect how publishers produce books, it has stimulated in accessibility implementation in the publishing industry globally, and this includes Australia. But before I talk about Australian context, I want to mention the European Accessibility Act, which was adopted in 2019, and which will enter in force in June 2025. Now, in contrast to the exception-based Marrakesh Treaty, the new European Accessibility Act requires publishers to produce digital publications in accessible formats for the European market, but not only books. The entire supply chain will need to be make content accessible and available to users through accessible services. Now, while this directive is important to European publishers, it will affect any organization wanting to sell books in the European market. Hence, its influence is much greater. And of course, as global publishers are improving their workflows and produce accessible content, this accessible content will also come to us. So this is really, really exciting. Now, coming back to Australia, following the implementation of Marrakesh Treaty and the adoption by the Australian government, in November 2016, representatives of the publishing industry, libraries, copyright organizations, disability associations, government, and accessible format producers met for the first time as part of the Marrakesh Treaty Forum in order to identify the key challenges to making published material accessible and build industry capacity. A year later, the forum was renamed the Australian Inclusive Publishing Initiative, and both Julie and I have been involved in this initiative. In 2019, Julie published the initiative published two guides. The first guide offers publishers a set of workflow strategies for creating accessible digital books, and Julie is a co-author of this guide. And the second one explains the legal environment for making books accessible to those with print disability. And if you would like to understand better what Marrakesh Treaty is about, I'd highly recommend looking at both. But there was a need for more practical guidelines on accessibility implementations in the publishing industry. So a team of editors led by Julie embarked on the task in the late 2021. And in April 2023, we released Books Without Barriers, a practical guide to inclusive publishing. The guidelines are based on our professional experience, review of international literature and existing guidelines, including those focusing on web accessibility. We also carried out surveys of readers with print disabilities and consulted broadly with accessibility experts, people with print disability, alternative format producers, editors, publishers, and even audiobook producers. And the guide contains 4 parts. In the first one, planning for inclusive publishing, we focus on the diverse ways in which the audience reads, how to develop accessibility policy for publishers, and planning the publishing workflow. In the second part, which focuses on developing content, we talk about writing and editing, creating accessible tables, and considerations for mathematics and sciences content. Now, the next part focuses on describing images and tables, on how to write image descriptions, and we also include lots of examples of descriptions for different types of illustrations in different contexts. And finally, the last part, focusing on producing accessible books. It looks on the design, digital formats, audiobooks, and testing and reviewing for quality assurance. There are also a couple of appendices, which includes a style sheet template for accessibility best practice and a glossary. Now, in this talk, we are going to focus on practical tips on how academic, library, and disability staff can embrace inclusive publishing practices that are based on industry best practice and which are covered in the guidelines in detail. Okay. So while publishers are ultimately responsible for the creation of accessible content, they operate in a complex book value chain with other stakeholders such as authors, librarians, booksellers, distributors, as well as hardware and software providers who all mediate the access to books for readers with print disability. And there are three areas where academic authors, disability staff, and librarians have an important role to play to improve access for those with print disability in the university context. The first one is acquisition and curator of content and resources. We should consider print disability when making purchasing and adoption decisions. So publishers, especially educational and scholarly, have been making progress on accessibility implementation globally, and it's really exciting, but not all on board yet. Regardless, librarians should raise the issue of accessibility when making purchasing decisions, and educators should take accessibility into account when making decisions on adoption of textbooks and learning resources for their units. Asking publishers about accessibility will provide them with another incentive to implement inclusive publishing workflows. Now, those librarians who provide research and teaching support should and could raise the issue of accessibility when talking to academics in relation to their publishing practices and educational materials they produce. But most importantly, researchers and educators should be thinking about accessibility when writing, publishing, or creating educational content for their students. And it is not just researchers. We are all content creators and publishers, whether we are academics, library, or disability staff. So we need to make sure that our websites, catalogs, services, resources, and marketing collateral, including social media, are accessible to people with print disability. Now, many libraries support library-based publishing programs, be it of scholarly monographs or open educational resources. Some libraries support publishing platforms such as Open Journal System. Inclusive publishing practices should be embedded in all these initiatives to make the content more accessible. Now I will hand over to Julie to talk about planning and writing with accessibility in mind. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and Julie will take over. So bear with us a second.
Okay, thanks, Agatha. This is me. Okay. Right. Yes, I'll start off talking about.
Sorry, Julie. It's just in not in presenter mode. Like we're just
not
seeing
in presenter mode.
Oh
Sorry.
well, we're just seeing all the slides. If we can get to full screen.
Yeah. Let me just check which one it is. I think it's.
Sorry, we didn't test you beforehand, did we?
We did. Yeah. Is that all right?
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So planning for accessibility. The first thing to think about, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is that not everyone reads visually. Some people access information through hearing or touch, or a combination of senses. So we need to ensure that the information we publish is flexible enough to be perceivable and understandable, no matter which sense or senses are used to read it. In other words, think about reading as a tactile and oral activity as well as a visual one. Your work as a writer may be read in a variety of different reading formats, including audio, tactile formats such as Braille, hard copy, including large print, or digital. If you haven't seen them already, UTS has created some really terrific videos about the many different ways their students read and the assistive technologies they use. These are available on YouTube, and we've included an example in our resources list. So if you go to the first one, you'll then find the rest of the suite on YouTube. There are 3 areas for writers to look at when considering how to make publications accessible. The first is writing. Again, think about how readers may access your publication. Instructions, descriptive elements, and symbols still need to make sense when the reader can't see the text. And we'll look at ways to do this in more detail in a moment. If your work is complex, such as a research paper, you could also consider adding a plain language overview. This will allow readers with learning difficulties and disabilities to understand what it's about, the main findings, and even if they might struggle to follow the more rigorous language used in the publication itself. The second is writing image descriptions and captions. You need to ensure that readers who can't see the text can understand what's in the illustrations and make sense of cross-references to them. All illustrations therefore need a figure number as well as a caption, and an image description, which is often called alt text, that conveys the key information in the illustration. And the third area to think about is the choice of images in your publication. When you're thinking about illustrations for your work, remember that someone, which is probably you, is going to have to describe what's in the image in order to make it accessible to readers who can't see it. Ideally, you want illustrations that are as uncluttered as possible, such as a photograph in which the subject obviously relates to the topic in hand, without there being too much extraneous information in the background. So, for example, if you were providing an illustration of a brontosaurus, you'd want a picture that features just a brontosaurus, rather than an illustration with lots of other types of dinosaurs in the background that will need describing too. Not only will this make the image description easier to write, but you'll usually end up with images that are better for everyone because they're clearer and much more focused. Also consider people with low vision when choosing illustrations. A cluttered graph with tiny labels is going to be very hard for anyone to read, particularly a reader with low vision or perceptual difficulties. So it may be better to use a key if there are lots of graph lines. And don't forget that some of your readers may be colorblind. You'll need to consider their needs too when choosing chart colors and avoid problem combinations such as red and green. And Agatha is going to talk about this more in her part of the presentation. Sorry, I just lost my... Right, so let's start with writing. And again, remember to consider different ways your material may be read. You can use this as a mental checklist. Will my material still make sense if it's heard or accessed by touch rather than seen? Is it still perceivable and understandable if it's provided in different formats? And of course, this consideration affects not only documents, but also websites, such as learning management platforms. The first thing we need to consider, oh, sorry, I just need to move on, that's better. The first thing we need to consider is how to structure your manuscript. The correct use of document styles and formatting is key to ensuring that all readers can find their way easily around the final publication. I can navigate my way around a publication by referring to the contents list. I can use the page numbers, and I might refer to an index at the back. And I can just flick or scroll through the pages to see the headings to find what I want. A reader with print disability may not be able to use the publication like this though, either because they can't manipulate the pages in this way, or because they can't see the information. The only way they may know what and where things are and find their way around the document is if you use styles in Microsoft Word to identify the different elements. Word styles identify what everything is. So for example, if you use them to identify your heading levels, you immediately get a working overview of the structure of the whole manuscript in the navigation pane. Not only is this important for readers with print disability, but it's also handy for you while you work. It can help you move around the manuscript easily by clicking on the headings in the navigation pane, and that'll automatically take you to that point in the manuscript. Another thing to remember is that your formatting is information that some people may hear, even though you can't see it. Screen readers read all page content, not just the text. So if you use visual cheats, you may be inadvertently passing on a lot of clutter, meaningless information that can make it harder for some readers to engage with your writing. You can check what extraneous information may have crept into your manuscript by turning on the Show Hide formatting tool, which is the Pilcrow or paragraph symbol in the toolbar. Some common visual cheats include using a string of character spaces rather than word styles, and the indent tool to create new paragraph indents, as I've done here, as hopefully you can see in this image. Using an extra return between each line of the text to create additional spacing, rather than the line and paragraph spacing function. And using lots of returns to start a new page, rather than a page break function, which is you can get through using insert plus page break or control plus enter on the keyboard. Visual cheats like these look okay when you hide the formatting, but the text won't sound okay if the formatting information is read aloud. So always use the correct tools. And another formatting issue is text boxes for callouts. Screen readers, including the read aloud function in Microsoft Word itself, skip text boxes, effectively making them invisible to a person who doesn't actually read visually. So if you want to box text elements in a Word document, use the paragraph borders function in Styles instead. So that's enough about formatting. Let's move on to language. The language you use should aim to enable and include all readers, helping them to understand your work. This means making sure they don't miss out on key information because of instructions given in language that has no meaning for them. The most common problem arises when items or objects are referred to solely by their visual appearance. So for example, if your manuscript contains illustrations that are referred to in the text, are they numbered so the reader listening can be sure which one's being referred to? So here the photo would have a figure number and a title, such as Figure 2, Roses in Bloom, rather than just being referred to as the picture of roses on the right. And if you do need to describe something by its appearance, provide other details about it as well as its color, such as the blue AC curve rather than the blue curve in a graph. This will allow readers who can't see the graphic or who can't perceive color to distinguish it from the other objects or features in the illustration. Another area to think about, for writers to think about, is their style choices. First of all, don't rely on visual cues such as italics and bold for emphasis or visual effect. These increase the information from load for Braille users as they have to be tagged in the Braille manuscript, creating additional Braille cells. Large blocks of italics can also be tiring and challenging for anyone to read, but especially for people with low vision or perceptual disabilities. Instead, try restructuring sentences or rephrasing to provide emphasis and color. This doesn't mean that italics should never be used, of course. They're fine when following established conventions, such as for the titles of publication, acts of parliament, and species names. However, they might not always be needed, so avoid them wherever you can. This includes italics for quotes. Quotes that are longer than a couple of sentences, you can be styled in an indented block, and you can use quote marks around short quotes, so you don't need italics as well for either of these. Another form that's hard to read is text that's styled in all capital letters. This includes headings. All caps can be difficult for most people to read, particularly with those with visual and perceptual disabilities. So again, avoid them wherever you can. You also need to factor in accessibility considerations when making style decisions about punctuation and using symbols. In particular, avoid using closed emeralds, which are long dashes, before clauses providing explanation, description, or further information. Closed dashes can be difficult for people with low vision and some perceptual disabilities to see. Instead, use spaced emeralds, which are smaller dashes with a space either side. Use double quote marks around short quotations and single quote marks only for quotes within quotes. This is another really important one. First of all, double quote marks can be easier to see for people with low vision. And second of all, double quote marks save a huge amount of time for Braille transcribers. Closing quote marks are visually indistinguishable from apostrophes, and the two symbols share the same key on the computer keyboard, but they have completely different Braille codes. After the text has been transcribed into Braille using specialist software, every quote mark and apostrophe in the proof has to be checked and manually corrected where necessary. This is intensive remediation, and it uses up precious resources that can be better spent elsewhere. Style decisions can also affect references. Of course, writers and editors don't always have a choice about the referencing style, as many disciplines, publishers, and universities follow specific style guides rigidly. However, if you do have any say in it, please advocate for minimal capital letters and punctuation. Unnecessary caps, full stops, and quote marks can create a lot of additional Braille cells, significantly increasing the information load for Braille users. Symbols are another area that can cause accessibility issues if they aren't used appropriately. Ensure you use the correct symbol rather than something that just looks like it, such as a dash or hyphen instead of a minus sign. You may not be able to see the difference, but the result will be very confusing when read aloud by a screen reader or transcribed into Braille. An X may look like a public multiplication symbol, for example, but it certainly doesn't sound like one. If I said to you 3x2, would you immediately know that I mean 3 multiplied by 2? Well, probably not. And symbols in circles, such as the copyright and registered trademark symbols, can also be difficult to interpret for some readers with perceptual disabilities. So write the word in full before the symbol to make sure the meaning is immediately clear. The final style issue we'll look at today is abbreviations. Shortened forms can be difficult to read and interpret for people with low vision, cognitive disabilities, and perceptual disabilities such as dyslexia. And while common acronyms such as that for the World Health Organization, WHO, are often recognized and read correctly by screen readers, less common ones may not be, especially if they contain vowels. So to help avoid confusion, explain acronyms the first time they're used, giving the full version first before the abbreviation in parenthesis, such as Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, in brackets ADCET. This will help readers understand what the abbreviation refers to, even if it's then mispronounced by the software. This also makes it easier on readers with dyslexia, who often struggle to interpret acronyms. Avoid Latin abbreviations in the text where possible too. Screen readers may try to pronounce abbreviations if they contain vowels. So for example, the letters IE may be read aloud as I, and EG might be pronounced egg. Instead, write that is, for example, or such as. And where you must use Latin abbreviations, such as in tables and charts, write them with full stop so that they'll be pronounced correctly, such as A stop, M stop, instead of AM. Another important consideration is how to convey the information in any illustrations in your work to readers who can't see them. Image descriptions are useful not only to readers who are blind. For example, non-visual learners may use them to help understand illustrations such as complex diagrams. And anyone listening to an audio version of your work will need an image description if they're going to understand any cross-references to the illustrations. How much detail to provide in this description will depend on the context and the purpose of the image. Image descriptions can be provided in two forms, Alternative text or alt text is a brief description of images that are simple or of medium complexity. In some contexts, just a few words might be enough. But if the image is complex or the context requires further detail, then an additional long description might be needed too. So there's a fine balance between providing too little detail in the description and too much. A reader who doesn't have a visual, learning, or cognitive disability may find that illustrations can help them understand the text better. So there's less stress on their short-term working memory. As a result, it takes them less effort to process the information than if only text is provided. However, the opposite experience can be true for some people with disability. A reader who can't see the illustration has to construct a mental image of it from the image description. This significantly increases their cognitive load. Too little information will create gaps in learning, in understanding, while too much detail creates mental clutter that impedes understanding. So here are some basic tips to help you describe your graphics. Describe all images unless they're purely decorative, such as borders. Think about the purpose of the image and then emphasize the key information in it that will convey this. Keep this description as brief as possible. Leave out any details that are unimportant and don't help the listener understand what the image is meant to convey. Provide information and concepts in small chunks, such as using succinct sentences. You can also provide the data of some graphics, such as graphs and flowcharts, in bullet or numbered lists. Provide each piece of information only once. Don't repeat what's in the body text or caption, and don't repeat in the long description what's in the alt text. Be objective. Don't make judgments or assumptions or attempt to interpret the image. Just describe what you can see. And include any text that's part of the image, such as signs or speech bubbles, unless they're irrelevant. We've kept it really simple here, but all of this information and more is in Books Without Barriers, with lots of examples of image descriptions for all types of illustrations, including diagrams, graphs, and tables. And finally, speaking of tables, these can be one of the most difficult elements to follow for some people with print disability. Readers who can't see the table must remember information that sighted readers can see at a glance. In other words, which column and row the value in each cell relates to. A screen reader will read each cell in the order in which it's set up. If the table isn't set up properly, the reading order may be jumbled and it will be difficult to understand the contents. So instead of using tab stops to create columns of information that look like a table, but which won't sound like one, use the Create Table tool, and that's the Insert Plus table in Microsoft Word. Don't create tables that have only one column. A single column of information isn't really a table at all. It's a list, and it should be treated like one, so readers who can't see it aren't left wondering where the missing columns are. Ensure all columns have headings, even if the heading seems obvious and could be inferred from the table caption. Headings help readers track what the data in any given cell refers to, so they should never be left out. Don't leave empty cells either. A reader listening to the information may find an empty cell confusing, as they don't know whether they've missed the data because it's not there or because they accidentally skipped it. If there are no values for a cell, signify this by using a 0 or a convention for null data for numbers, or NA, or not applicable for text. And finally, avoid creating large complex tables wherever possible. If the table's too big, the Braille transcription of it won't fit on one page, so the table will be even harder to understand. And it's also very difficult to create a mental picture of a huge table by listening to what's in it. Instead, consider whether a large table can be broken up into smaller, simpler tables covering individual aspects of a topic, rather than condensing all the information into one big table. This is an improvement that can benefit all readers again, not just people with print disability, as it makes the information more digestible. And finally, just thinking about working with publishers. As an author, you have the opportunity to champion accessibility best practice, not only with your own writing, but also in your interactions with your publisher. So ask lots of questions. In doing so, you may be able to encourage the publisher to think more carefully about the accessibility of their publications, if they're not doing so already. And some examples of the kinds of questions you could ask include, will the publication be made available in accessible formats, such as EPUB or Microsoft Word, rather than just print and/or PDF, which are not accessible to all readers? Will accessibility considerations be taken into account in editorial style decisions, such as punctuation choices and the referencing style used? Will graphs and charts be drawn in such a way that people with color blindness can still distinguish the different elements? And will image descriptions be provided? Am I expected to write them? Or would it help if I provide notes about the key points in the images if someone else will be writing the descriptions? Well, thank you. I'll hand over now to Agatha, who's going to talk about educational materials.
Thank you so much. And I'll just quickly share my screen. And here we are. So I'll talk about design and formats, and I'm aware we are sort of running a little bit out of time, but I'll be fast. So inclusive design is about designing content. Thinking of the needs of people with various disabilities from the moment the design is conceived. And there are several areas that we should think, which apply to both print and digital format. It's really important. And there's a comment in the chat around the use of the correct typeface for both print and digital definitely helps. So we should think about hierarchy, consistency and proximity, legibility and readability, color contrast, and colorblind friendly palettes. And Julie already mentioned appropriate use of images and graphic elements. So hierarchy. In visual design, hierarchy in text is conveyed to variation in weight, color, spacing, size, placements, and other signals. And this is particularly important in the design of textbooks and other educational resources, which tend to be really complex. And here's an example. So we've got just a row of headings and just paragraph text into columns. On the left, we've got a logical and clear visual hierarchy with consistent heading formatting, consistent color of the font, and every heading is followed by a paragraph text. Now, on the right, the example has stacked headings. So there's a no paragraph under heading 1. It's got inconsistent hierarchy. It's the colors are used inconsistently, the spacing is inconsistent. It just looks really illogical. So it's best to avoid that. Now, it's best to structure similar information together to distinguish between a section and visually guide readers. The principle of proximity states that things that are close together appear to be more related. So when, for example, with headings, the space before the heading should be bigger than the space after the heading. It's important to place headings and page numbers in a consistent location. And the design of pages in learning environments such as Canvas should also be consistent. Now, captions, they should be placed in above images ideally, so that when they are read by assistive technology, they would be read first before the image description, and definitely consistency across the publication. Now, in terms of legibility and readability, legibility is related to the design of the typeface and the shape of the glyphs. Now, readability is influenced by how the text is arranged of typeset on a page, and I'm just talking about readability in the context of design. Now, it is important to point out that the sans serif versus serif debate is redundant. So we know that in both these categories, there are problematic typefaces. So what's important is to avoid those typefaces with extremely light and heavy weights, with complicated or decorative appearance, with extreme stroke contrast, with very small counters that is enclosed of semi-enclosed negative shapes, those with less open or small apertures, and those with imposter letters or mirroring letters such as capital I and 1, D and B, Q and P. that is based to avoid formatting text in caps and italics. I think I skipped one. Yes, now we also should avoid ligatures. Ligature is a special character that combines 2 or sometimes 3 characters into a single character. And these are problematic to read, not only for people with poor vision, but also for assistive technologies. We also should pay attention to font size, leading, and tracking. Left-aligned text is best rather than justified. And we should pay attention to the line length. It should be between 45 and 80 characters. And now the use of, oops, hang on a second, I'm just getting a bit confused. Yes, now color. So we need to pay close attention to the use of color. Make sure there's enough contrasts. And there are a number of color contrast checkers online that you can use. It is important that the colors use consistency, as I said before, and important to use colorblind friendly palettes. As Julie mentioned, red-green color blindness is the most common format and is best to avoid it. If needed, it's good to make one of these colors much darker than the other. And it's also important to make sure that color is not the only distinguishing attribute. And this is particularly important in maps, charts, and graphics. So choose an ambiguous color combination, that is colors with strong contrast. Use additional visual variables such as shape, size, pattern variation, provided that can be easily described, and annotate features directly, either as labels and keys or extra legends. And I've got an example here of a chart that in which each line, apart from having a different color, has also different texture, and there's also a legend. And if in doubt, it is very good practice to convert the image into grayscale and check if it still makes sense. Now, in terms of images, as Julie mentioned, they should be meaningful and clear, and it's also best to avoid placing text over busy images. And here on the right, I've got an example of a bushy background with backyard basics written over it, and the image on top, it's not very clear, not very visible. In the lower image, we've got a navy blue band, and the text is much better, much more visible. And it's also good to avoid placing watermarks or any complicated background elements. Tables. Again, Julie talked about the need for them to be simple and avoid empty cells, but there's also things we can do in terms of design to make them better, even in print in particular. So they should have clearly defined header border, they should have good color contrast, adequate space between text and border, so that the cell content do not merge visually with the borders of the table, no empty cells, and correct alignments. And here is, I've got a slide with a couple of examples. In the example on the left, the text is really hard to read with cramped cells and no shading. While the same table, the same information in the table on the right has better spacing around the text in the rows and columns and light blue shading on alternate rows of data. So you can see it's much more legible to everyone. Now, in terms of formats, producing formats, if you provide if you provide just the manuscript to the publisher, manuscript Word remains the industry standards for books and journal articles, with the exception of LaTeX in maths. And in terms of formatting, ideally it should be formatted using the styles that, as Julie mentioned, but it's also important to follow general guidelines, of course, which may require specific formatting. What's important to remember is that if you provide alternative text, they need to be provided separately to publishers, not embedded in the document. And this is different if you produce documents for the final output. So you actually publish them yourself, be it on the website or in your learning management system. In this case, the accessibility features need to be embedded in the document. And now when you're producing content for learning platforms such as Canvas, you have a choice of what file to use. And while PDF unfortunately remains the default choice, please note that this is not an accessible format. It's very difficult to make it accessible, and it's just not good. Hence, Microsoft Word is better choice, or even HTML. And PowerPoint slides are better than PDFs. So it's better to distribute PowerPoints to students. It usually makes them accessible. So why PDF is problematic? Well, even if compliant with the web accessibility guidelines like WCAG 2.1, PDFs are not customizable. So they are not easy to use with students with poor vision. But if you really need to use PDF, it is best to implement as many accessibility features as possible in the source document. And this is really time consuming. And then export as best for electronic distribution and accessibility in Word, and best as accessible PDF in InDesign, Adobe InDesign. And check it. The file will need further remediation in Adobe to make it accessible. And of course, PDF needs to be editable to be accessible via screen readers. Now, in terms of long-form documents, and I'm thinking especially in open educational resources, Microsoft Word, HTML, and Reflowable EPUB 3 is better than PDF. Reflowable EPUB 3 is particularly recommended because users can change the reading experience can customize it by changing typeface, font size, spacing, margins, and background. They do need to include a lot of accessibility considerations, such as alt text descriptions, heading in logical order, HTML, 5 tags, page list, landmarks, ARIA coding, page title, accessibility metadata, and so on and so forth, which sounds really complicated, but the plus is that much of the coding can be implemented by using the right tool, which brings me to the list of tools that are available. So the DAISY consortiums released a tool called Word to EPUB, which is free and it can be downloaded, unfortunately only for Windows operating systems. I'm sure I haven't been able to check it. I'm using Mac, so I couldn't, but I'm sure it complies with all the accessibility considerations and produces a really good EPUB file. Now, Pressbooks, which some of you might be familiar with, it's a WordPress-based platform for publishing books in multiple formats. It produces ebooks, webbooks, and print-ready PDFs. And it has a choice of different templates and results in accessible EPUB 3 files. So this is a really good one to use. Now, in terms of the industry, the publishing industry is still wedded to Adobe InDesign, which is very complex. And unfortunately, at this stage, the EPUB 3 file requires complex remediation to be accessible. And there is a software called Circular Flow that helps to add rich accessibility to InDesign exports. So if you really want to use InDesign, you might want to look at that. And if you really want to use InDesign, get in touch with me and I can send you some handouts about how to implement accessibility properly, what you can do. Now, whichever way you produce your accessible file, whether it's Microsoft Word or PDF or EPUB 3 or HTML, you need to make sure, you need to carry out quality assurance. And it consists of both review and testing. The review process is designed to check the content for accuracy, clarity, and completeness, while accessibility testing focuses on checking that the file works as it should. So, and this is really important because digital formats need to be validated and tested to make sure they're machine readable. In Microsoft Word, we've got tools, embedded tools. So there's a check accessibility button in Adobe PDF. You can do accessibility check and then follow the recommendations. And the DAISY consortiums released a Spy DAISY app, which checks the accessibility of EPUB for EPUB 3. And it's very important to do those accessibility testing first before you carry out a manual test using read aloud function or screen readers. And then at the end, if you have space and have an opportunity, test it with users with print disability for very important documents. So first automate it to get rid of all the minor issues and then check the document manually. And this brings me to platform accessibility. So Canvas and Moodle, and I presume other learning platforms that are available, they all have guidelines on how to publish those learning platforms, how to embed accessibility in those learning platforms. And it's very important to pay attention to it. And an open journal system that I mentioned before that is widely used for the production of open journals, open access journals, they also have a very extensive guide for journal editors and authors, and it will be good to remind editors and authors to use it and implement it so that the journals produced are accessible. It's not just about open access, it's also about making them accessible. And this brings me to the end of our presentation. If you haven't had a chance yet, please download Books Without Barriers and check them out. And there's a link here. And there's a couple of other resources that you might find useful. Accessibility Toolkit, second edition, is an open educational resource. Accessible Libraries Canada has got an enormous amount of resources and checklists, including how to produce an accessible email. Someone in the chat already mentioned the call checking accessibility of open textbooks guidelines, which is really good. And at the end, you've got a link here to the UTS Learn Experience Lab that Julie mentioned before. So yes, we would love to hear from you what you think about the guidelines. And also, if you can't find something, if you've got any comments, any suggestions, please let us know, because both Julie and I are very committed to working with the industry to make sure that we help them to get on board with accessibility implementation. It's not easy. I know, I'm speaking from experience. I've worked on this at Sydney University Press. Together we can make things happen. So thank you so much, and please let me know if you have any questions. And here are our contact details as well. So I'm easily findable at the University of Sydney, and Julie can contact at apaipi@editors.org.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Agata and Julie. That was absolutely brilliant presentation. And as always, you kind of think you know so much until you realise you don't know a lot. So I learned quite a few tricks and tips today. So thank you so much. There's been some fabulous chat, which is great. I love when our audience really works, really chats away. And have been sharing resources and knowledge and so forth. So thank you everybody for sharing that. We have a couple of questions. One is from Darren. Can you share some of the common misconceptions and myths you have heard about accessible publishing?
Well, one that I've certainly heard a lot is that accessibility issues only affect quite a small number of people. So is it really worth it? And that's obviously, I think, used as an excuse not to do it because it's perceived as being too difficult to do, which is also not necessarily so. I think there's that a misconception that it only affects blind people.
Yeah.
The other sort of like on the format side is that like EPUB is accessible because it's digital, which is not, you have to make a good EPUB for it to be accessible. Like the inclusion of alternative text is the first consideration. If you don't, it's not accessible, apart from the extra coding. And also, I guess in publishing, there's still this thinking, it's going, that it's not our business, that it's, disability organizations are there to produce digital formats, but it's just so much more expensive and time consuming to do it, to remediate documents instead of actually starting with born accessible or conceived accessible publications in the first place. So industry is moving, they're working, different companies are working. There's more, like, since we've been involved with Julie, like I've seen enormous amount of guidelines and materials and initiatives globally working on this. So we'll get there eventually. Yep. I'm positive.
Brilliant, it's great to have that positive attitude. Somebody asked about a suggestion for a good font. I struggle to find a common font that avoids mirroring characters.
Lots of fonts are useful for that. I just want to point out that we designed our PowerPoints with Atkinson's Hyperlegible, which has been a font designed especially for people with print disability. So I don't want to sort of multitask, but maybe I can send a font. Yep. You can Google it to find it online, but this is like a really good and perfectly designed font.
Or if Jane's listening, she might be able to Google it and put the link in while we're talking. One of the things that James, who was fabulous in the chat, thank you, James, is that with the table design tab, word to tick last column. When this isn't done, screen readers can actually end up getting caught up in a loop because it just keeps creating another tab. So a really important trick and tip to use when creating tables. So the other question from Serena, sorry, do you have any advice for teaching referencing in an accessible way? How do we ensure that all elements of a reference entry are conveyed by a screen reader in a way that allows the learner to understand the different elements and then replicate them when creating their own referencing?
Referencing, yes.
I think we might need a new another video, another webinar just on that. That'd be great.
It's always difficult because what works for one person with disability might not work for somebody else with disability. So, for example, we've advocated taking out as many full stops as possible. But obviously that can then create problems for someone listening because which is better for Braille users, minimal punctuation. So I think it's difficult. I think really it's just everything is down to context, and it's really involves trying to think about all the different types of disability for people who might be accessing the reference, and yeah, trying to accommodate as many as you can. So yeah, keep it simple. I mean, that's the main one for me, is keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah, no, that's
Agata,
great.
do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think it covers. Yeah, I mean, it's really complicated because publishers are attached, and not just publishers, different disciplines are attached to specific referencing styles, and it's really hard to sort of move people away. It's treated as a Bible, and it's not. It's just a system that we agree on. So, and like we've done so much research into referencing, and there's not really appetite for sort of, I guess maybe no research so far done on like which system is more accessible. So we know that some are more complicated than the others, but how we can simplify it and make sure that it's actually accessibility friendly, something on this.
We do have something in Books Without Barriers that compares briefly the different systems, so using endnotes, footnotes, and so on. And again, it's very context dependent which one's going to work.
Yep, yeah. Excellent. Now there's probably 3 more questions left. So I don't think we're going to have time to answer more. Depends on how short your answers are. But somebody's asked around if anybody's had any experience with SpringShare LibGuides. I'm currently redesigning our referencing guides. Have either of you come across that?
No, that's library.
No one's answered that one. So yeah, this one probably could be a long answer, but would you be able to provide a clear explanation for how the WCAG guides relates to published documents, Word and PDF? Is it an issue that comes up from time and it's an issue that comes up from time to time, and I don't have a clear way to respond.
Do you want to take this one?
It's difficult for us. We did reference the WCAG guidelines, but apart from anything else, they don't always, they're designed for web, so for web designers, so they don't always cover everything you need to know, and sometimes they can almost be inappropriate for certain types of publishing. So judiciously and with common sense. I think with all of this, it all comes down to common sense. When you think about it, is this going to work or not? So
it's some of the like color contrast is really useful. It's been developed on, it's easy to check on the web. It's particularly relevant for digital publications. So, and I'm thinking here of EPUB, not PDF. For me, PDF is tragical, not digital. But so this is like, we actually we like use guidelines quite a lot, but this, as you said, not all of it is relevant to publishing, and it has heaps of gaps. So definitely check it. But the other thing is around content accessibility. Not all of it is relevant for publishers. For example, scholarly publishers, they've got other audiences, so making sure that the content is written in plain language is not relevant. So it's very complex.
Yep. No, that's great. Well, we actually had a couple of more questions come in as well, so we won't get to all those. We forgot to ask at the beginning if you're okay to answer them separately, and we'll put them on our website. So we'll do that. So thank everybody for participating in the chat and the Q&A. It's absolutely brilliant. We will be doing a short survey of this webinar. We really encourage you to take that survey. We currently looking at our future and our funding, and your feedback on these and future webinars assist us in that argument. We also encourage you, if you don't already, to sign up to our newsletter. And we have some brilliant future webinars coming up. One is making labs accessible for all. And also the next one after that is enabling inclusive employability around work integrated learning. So yeah, so lots of great stuff coming up. This was a brilliant presentation. Thank you so much, Agata and Julie. It was lovely to have such practical demonstrations, and you can see from the chat that people really valued it, and we valued yeah, what you've done. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Take care, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.